speaker today is Robert Jameson. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Robert in just a second, but I want to talk a little bit about the award itself and introduce somebody else as well. The Laird Essay Contest is something that's been going on for 20 years. It is named in honor of the late Dr. Roy D. Laird, as well as his wife Betty Laird, who continues to contribute to the program. And it is an award in honor of the made to an essay that is a think piece, something that definitely has citations and reference, but at the same time has a point of view, something to get across in the paper. And so we're very happy. It is actually the 20th anniversary of the award. And so this year, in fact, Betty agreed to make an undergraduate award as well as a graduate award. And so this year, for the first time, we have an undergraduate award which went to Natalie Kristen Peril for her essay, Progress Through Dispute, the Caspian Oil Power Struggle and Its Effects on Central Asian Cooperation. I recognize her. And then our speaker today is, as I said, is going to be receiving the graduate award, which amounts to a $500 award, book budget of $75. And then Kristen will get the $250 undergraduate award. Robert wrote on Crimea as Kosovo and Sudetenland, the Peril of Historical Narratives in the 2014 Russo-Ukrainian crisis. A very timely topic, and I've already seen a few inquiries from people from DC, actually, interested in reading the essay and talking to Robert about it. He is a history Ph.D. Student. He received his bachelor's degree in history and international studies from Mountain Mercy College, and then his master's degree in history from Iowa State. And his paper, Armageddon's Shortening Fuse, How Advances in Nuclear Weapons Technology Push Strategists to Mutually Assured Destruction, was published in spring 2013 by the Air Force Historical Foundation. He's received a FLAS for study in Czech Republic. Congratulations.
All right, thanks again, Dr. Clark. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon to talk about this topic. It's one that I have a great deal of interest in, and it's one that continues to be sort of important and relevant as we go forward here into the spring and summer. So, Crimea, Kosovo, or Sudetenland? Some brief preparatory remarks, just quotes that I want to sort of keep in your mind as we go through here, because they're touchstone ideas that I really use to refer back to as I created this presentation, as I wrote the essay. The first is Leszek Kołakowski's quote that we learn history, not in order to know how to behave or how to succeed, but to know who we are. And the second is Daniel Goerstein. The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. So these touchstones here of the non-instrumental use of history, coupled with this sort of emphasis on uncertainty. So why did I pick Crimea to look at? Well, part of it is just sort of mercenary timeliness on my part, right? When the Laird essay guidelines were sent out, when I saw them, was early March. The March 16th referendum took place a couple of days actually before I ended up finishing the paper and sending it in. I also have an intrinsic interest in the region. I have several friends of mine who live either in Ukraine or who are Ukrainians working as expatriates outside the country. So I'm sort of continuously hearing feedback from them about what's happening, current events in their country. I saw Crimea as in many ways the catalyst for historical discourse employment. What I saw reading the news about Crimea and the situation as it developed in March was sort of this explosion, this proliferation of different stories coming from all kinds of different neighbors in the region, from Ukrainians themselves, from Russian official and unofficial sources, and from the West. And I found that to be really, really very interesting. There are obviously broader ramifications to the Crimean crisis. We're still seeing ripple effects from this go out into southern and eastern Ukraine and on the international stage with things like NATO deployments to Eastern Europe. And finally, I saw in the whole crisis the signs of overdetermination and irreducible complexity. This issue of everyone trying to explain why the Crimean annexation happened the way that it did, and what Putin's next moves would be, and how the West should or should not respond to those. So just to bring us up to speed, this is I think, still fairly current and fairly accurate map. This is May 1st, today's May 6th. I don't think too much has changed in the interval, although events are moving rapidly. We have this sort of arc of instability, mostly in eastern Ukraine, but now also popping up in Odessa with the events of last week. And of course, Crimea there, sort of labeled as disputed. And the image, along with all the news articles I was reading, the image that really provoked my interest in all the different historical narratives that were being bandied about with regard to Crimea was this image here, which a friend sent to me. And it's of a Danish anti-Russian protest that broke out immediately with the Crimean crisis. And this sort of way in which we have 4 flag-covered bodies, right? 1956, 1968, 2008, 2014. Hungarian Revolution, the Prague Spring, the Russo-Georgian conflict in 2008, and then now the conflict in Ukraine. And this interested me because of the way in which these separate events, these separate actual factual historical events, had been arranged so as to give the impression of a continuity, right, of a relationship among these events that implied certain things about Russian tendencies or about Russia itself, even though, of course, 56, 68, it's a whole different state. It's different actors within that state making decisions based on different motives and different goals than Russia in 2008 or Russia in 2014. But arranging them this way gives this impression, right? Creates this discourse of continuity in certain tendencies of Russia. But getting back to this question of an abundance of narratives that were emerging in the news media at this time, everyone seems to think the past is prologue. They can read past actions of Putin, they can read past events in Russian history or in Soviet history and predict the future or understand the present in a better way. But the question is, which pasts are being invoked and why? Right? What lessons do those particular pasts that people are bringing up and using to make sense of the current crisis, what are those teach? What lessons do they teach? Overall, I saw that there were 2 sort of oppositional narratives emerging, this binary of Kosovo and Sudetenland. And the official Russian position was very much Crimea understood to be like Kosovo, Crimea as Kosovo. The Western position, to a large extent, I saw was Crimea being presented as like Sudetenland. And I'll get into that in a second here. Along with this, though, there are lots of what I call interstitial perspectives, right? Voices that weren't as loud, but there were a lot of them. You have the perspectives of neighbors like Finland or Poland or Moldova, trying to make sense of this crisis and referring back to their particular experiences with Russia or the Soviet Union in the past. And throughout all of this, I saw that there were serious risks of mining the past to try to dredge up lessons, to try to dredge up guides to future action, or guides to present understanding. And an example of that kind of risk is this, right? This is the December 1993 international section of The Independent, which is a very reliable newspaper and does good reporting. And the Independent title here, right, is Anti-Soviet Warrior Puts His Army on the Road to Peace. And it talks about how this individual is helpfully building roads in impoverished countries like northern Sudan. And of course the title itself, right, he's on the road to peace. Now of course this is 93, and this is Osama bin Laden, right? And there's a serious detour that happens away from this road to peace. But this is really looking at the past and saying he was an anti-Soviet warrior. This is 93, the Soviet Union is gone. He's on the road to peace. It's not a great guide to the future. So Crimea is Sudetenland, right? What did I get this impression from? In addition to the comments of the former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who in an unusual bipartisan move was actually being backed up by Republican senators like John McCain and Marco Rubio. We have the sort of Visegrad perspective from the region itself. Karl Schwarzenberg, the former Czech foreign minister, is saying that really what's happening in Ukraine is history repeating itself. Putin is acting along the same principle as Adolf Hitler in sort of annexing areas with the co-ethnic protection justification. We have Donald Tusk, the current Polish prime minister, saying that history shows that those who appease all the time in order to preserve peace usually only buy a little bit of time. Right, this sort of famous appeal to the Munich experience. And the Ukrainians, many of them, don't disagree with this idea that Crimea is Sudetenland, and that to some extent it predicts future aggression, future annexation from Putin, from the Russian side of things. This is a bit faint, and I apologize for that, but basically the billboard says, we defeated Hitler, we will defeat Putin as well. And in case that analogy wasn't clear enough, I don't know how well you can see this, unfortunately, I'm sorry. Putin has the Hitler hairstyle and the Hitler mustache drawn on, just to really visually drive home the comparison to you. On the other end of things, right, we have this narrative of Crimea is Kosovo, not Sudetenland at all, it's Kosovo. So Russia today, March 21st, is saying the West hasn't legitimized Crimea's decision to secede from Ukraine. But what makes one breakaway more justifiable than another, right? Kosovo broke away from Serbia, Crimea broke away from Ukraine. Equivalence. Vladimir Putin, in his celebratory address after the annexation of Crimea, is pointing out that the Crimean authorities themselves refer to the well-known Kosovo precedent. And just to really drive home the dig, he says a precedent our Western colleagues created with their own hands in a very similar situation. And of course, then we have a reinforcement of this narrative. You can't see it too well, but on the far left here, this burning doorway in this sort of apartment building cartoon is Serbia, which NATO was bombing in the 90s, which Kosovo broke away from. We have Iraq, we have Libya, we have Syria, and sort of Uncle Sam carrying his NATO handbag of death and destruction from place to place. But luckily for Ukraine, right? Luckily for Ukraine, they have the big protective Russian bear lounging in the doorway, ready to defeat US and NATO attempts to inflict this kind of suffering on Ukraine. Even before the Crimean annexation occurs, even before the Crimean referendum occurs, we already have Crimea being labeled as part of Russia in official discourse and official presentation, right? The borders are already being annexed prior to any actual political process. So when we look at these two narratives, I see some potential hazards in what I call discursive tunneling, right? We have a serious failure to distinguish the object, which is Crimea, which is its own place with its own history and its own particular circumstances, from the referent in each of these cases, which are Kosovo or Sudetenland, depending on the side you're presenting this from. But in either case, it creates discursive tunnels with troubling conclusions, because if Crimea is Kosovo, who are the ethnic cleansers? Who are the Serbs in this scenario, if not the provisional government in Kyiv? And in fact, that's probably one of the least inflammatory accusations thrown at the government in Kyiv, who have been called many things besides that. But this is one of the conclusions you can draw from presenting Crimea as Kosovo. If Crimea is presented as Sudetenland, then who are the Nazis in this scenario, who are going to keep annexing and keep expanding unless they are stopped and the appeasement stops, right? So how might these conclusions shape our attitudes and our actions on both sides of these things? It can create a spiraling discursive dance, where because you need to protect Russian co-ethnics or Russophones in Ukraine, and because it's a Kosovo situation where you genuinely think, or you repeat the rhetoric often enough, that ethnic cleansing is going to go on, it justifies a lot of actions. If you genuinely think that Crimea is like the Sudetenland, and that its annexation presages further annexations and further aggression unless it's stopped, unless you don't appease them anymore, this creates problems. I pushed the wrong button. I don't know what I did. Aha! Good. One of the ways the spiraling discursive dance gets a bit out of control is that everyone becomes a fascist. And I mean everyone. Vladimir Putin in the same March 18th celebratory address says, basically nationalists, neo-Nazis, Russophobes, and anti-Semites executed this coup in Kyiv. And they continue to set the tone in Ukraine to this day. All right. And so we see things like this. This is a billboard prior to the Crimean vote, in which the Russians are engaging in this sort of age-old tactic of presenting a false binary, right? Either or, black or white. If you vote, right, on 16th of March, we choose either a fascist Nazi Crimea or this wonderful and sort of it's rippling the breeze Russian flag version of Crimea. So yeah, you vote not to be independent, not to be part of Russia, you're voting for fascism. You're voting for Nazis. Of course, the Ukrainians can return this rhetoric just as well. We have a Ukrainian artist here who's taken to drawing Putin, kind of sad Putin, with the comb over, with the Hitler mustache. Again, it's not any longer enough to say Putin is like Hitler. Putin is literally Hitler. Object is no longer separate from referent in a lot of these exercises. And again, there's a Ukrainian message board online which I look through because it's interesting. And this was posted to sort of tell you, you see, the Russians are becoming fascists. They're becoming Nazis, if they aren't already. We have this explicit comparison set up between Velikaya Rossiya, this sort of conservative, even by Russian standards, Russian political party, and the Nazis. The propaganda sort of set side by side there. Now, on the one hand, this is very visually appealing, right? It seems to make sense. Look, they're aping Nazi propaganda. They're basically Nazis. On the other hand, you have to realize, right, eagles feature as a motif in a lot of official states. Ours, for example, although it's bald, and not two-headed. And you know, healthy, smiling families are also not exactly uncommon in political discourse. So while initially this sort of comparison is appealing, it's not necessarily all that revealing when looked at closely. On the other hand, maybe they're not fascists. Maybe, and I've seen this emerge especially in American and Western discourse, maybe Putin and the Russians are actually neo-Soviet, or return to the Soviet period. And so we see Putin is sort of dropping off his little green men at the doorsteps of Donetsk and Kharkiv out of a Soviet baby carriage, sort of trying to return back to the Soviet past. And we know, right, famously in 2005, Putin addressed the issue of the Soviet Union, saying that its collapse was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So this is a certain viewpoint. Again, this is the sort of Ukrainian, I don't want to say nationalist, but it's certainly, particularly Ukrainian point of view, probably pro-Kyiv, right, pro-provisional government. And what interested me the most about this was this particular figure of the local separatist in these regions. It's the only woman in the lineup, first of all, and it's especially not an attractive woman. She has 2 teeth coming out of her mouth like vampiric fangs. And one of the specific references to identify who she is are that these local separatists are post-Soviet nostalgics. Right? So again, it's the return to the Soviet Union, and they're also labeled as uneducated, unemployed, marginal, right? And this sort of dismisses their point of view to an extent. This is lovely, and I promise it's the only Simpsons gif of the entire presentation. But the Simpsons called this American refusal or trouble of distinguishing Russia from the Soviet Union way back in the 1990s. And it still continues with a lot of American politicians wanting to think of Putin's actions as a return to the Soviet Union or the Soviet period. So we'll just quickly quickly watch this. So right, it was all a trick, right? The Russians were never really reformed. They were always sort of Soviet underneath. And nowadays, right, we see sort of a return to this. This is one narrative emerging from things. And the interstitial perspectives, right? All of these perspectives that don't necessarily take part in the Crimea as Sudetenland or Crimea as Kosovo narrative, they still have points of view on this whole crisis and how it affects them and how it affects their relationship to Putin's Russia. Finland, for example, if you read Finnish news, General Gustav Haglund, who is the former Finnish defense minister, came out in the newspaper and essentially said, oh, well, the Russians won't dare come back to Finland. We gave them a bloody nose last time. We stand by our historic achievements in the Winter War, right? So they're going all the way back to 1940 for that particular memory of Russian-Finnish interaction. And importantly, right, they're skipping over all of the ensuing history and all of the history prior to that with Russia. It's that particular moment that they're remembering. Estonia is concerned because even recently, in 2007, the removal of a World War II era Soviet memorial in Tallinn, capital, was the occasion for widespread massive cyber warfare conducted against their government, which was suspected to come, but never proved, of course, from Russia. Poland thinks back to its partition and destruction as a state in the late 18th century, and its rule of large parts of it by Russia, the Russian Empire in the ensuing period, the Molotov-Ribbentrop betrayal in World War II, and the conquest of its eastern territory. Moldova doesn't have to look back very far. It just looks across the Dniester River and looks at Transnistria and sees a frozen conflict that's been sponsored by Russia for the last 20 or so years. So it has that view of Russia. Sweden has to go all the way back to 1808, which I found particularly charming. Because Sweden, when they were talking about their need to up their defense expenditures to increase the purchase of Gripen jets, for example, they mentioned that in 1808, the Russians briefly took over the island of Gotland in the Baltic. So Sweden also has memories that are being involved here. Turkey has talked about the need to protect Crimean Tatar population, which only recently, within the last couple of decades, returned to Crimea. But also they go all the way back to a treaty with Catherine the Great, who, as the Turkish newspaper put it, essentially, had made the treaty so that if Russian authority over Crimea had ever lapsed, Crimea would return to Turkey, if I remember this correctly. So this was sort of half in jest. The Turkish newspaper didn't really expect Crimea to be handed over to Turkey, but it was an interesting perspective nonetheless. There we go. So as I've said, we have all these particular memories and all these particular pasts being brought into the discourse about what Russia is, what its tendencies are, what its past is, and how that points to the future. But we also have a lot of forgetting that goes on in order to make this happen. So we have usable pasts, not necessarily whole pasts. We don't have anyone treating the whole of Russian and Soviet history. We just have people picking out particular bits that are useful for the present moment and useful for how they view current relations with Russia. One example of this would be Ukrainian and Polish relations, which recently have been very good between Poland and the provisional government in Kiev. Poland has, especially if you read the kinds of things that Radek Sikorski has been writing, taken this sort of paternal approach to Ukraine. They want to protect the provisional government in Kiev, they want to sponsor them, they've been their advocate in the European Union. But of course, this neglects, this new friendship, which I think is a positive sign, does neglect a past history of Polish domination of Western Ukraine as landlords, and of Ukrainian ethnic cleansing of Poles toward the end of World War II to get them out of Western Ukraine, where 60,000 people died. So we're forgetting some past because they're not useful in the present moment. and we're pulling others into the present. In this case, Poles will often talk about how they have a fraternal relationship with the Ukrainians because they were brothers within the same country for so many centuries. In Ukraine itself, some Soviet pasts are acceptable. For example, Khrushchev's transfer of Crimea to Ukraine in the 50s is an acceptable Soviet past because it benefits, I mean, let's face it, Ukrainians who want to keep Crimea as part of their state. And some Soviet pasts are unacceptable, and we see this symbolically with the toppling of Lenin statues that occurred all throughout Ukraine in the period of February, March. We see a mercenary sifting of the past in all of these places. From the Russian perspective, going back to Vladimir Putin's March 18th speech, one of the things that he talks about is how Crimea has always been part of Russia, and part of Russian history. And that you can go all the way back to Prince Vladimir and his baptism and his Christianization in Kiev and Rus to legitimize Crimea's organic integration to Russian history and the Russian state. But of course, this begs the question, well, if Crimea is such an integral part of Kiev and Rus, why are you detaching Crimea from Kiev and bringing it into the Russian state, into the Muscovite-centered state? But these are, again, usable paths, not necessarily full paths. So if, right, the universe, as we know it, is a joint product of the observer and the observed, and we know that the observed doesn't itself change. It's physical, it's regulated by predictable natural laws, it has a physical reality independent of observation, then the observer is what we have to pay careful attention to. And how the observer views physical realities, how the observer views history, is the side of the equation that changes the most dramatically. This is an example of that. All of the newspaper discourse that I was reading was really focused on the dangers of Russian aggression, the dangers to the Ukrainian state of disintegration, all of these various paths of war and defense and security issues, and none of them really focused on things like this, which is extremely contemporary and very important. This is a March 15th anti-war protest, pro-Ukrainian protest, taking place in Moscow, which tens of thousands of people participated. You can see the Ukrainian flags waving there interspersed with the Russian flags. And that, to me, is no less important, no more important, than something as far back as the 1808 Russian annexation of Gotland. But it isn't being bubbled to the surface as part of this discourse. It's being ignored or not emphasized. Things like this, Slavic brotherhood, right, as much as it's a trope and as much as it's easy to mock, as much as it gets abused on all sides, is something that is genuine. There is a great deal of social union between Ukrainians and Russians. A very close friend of mine, who is working for the European Union's border assistance mission for Moldova and Ukraine right now, has a Russian mother and a Ukrainian father. This social union and this union of friendships, this union of culture, is there. But it's not being emphasized. What's being emphasized is Russian predation upon Ukraine, or Ukrainian fascists and their danger to Russophones in Ukraine, which I think is unfortunate. And the result of this discursive dance, where we engage in driving tensions further, and we remember certain paths that are about aggression and not about fraternity, and that are about danger and not about cooperation, peace, is things like this, where you have NATO buildups of soldiers, of fighter jets especially, being brought in all along the borders of the post-Soviet space. And the danger is that Russian responses to this, and NATO responses to Russian responses to this, become this spiraling problem that gets out of control. So some concluding points, and I'm glad that I'm actually concluding, so I'll have plenty of time for questions here. There are no instrumental lessons in the past, going all the way back to that Leszek Kolakowski quote, right? That's not the point of studying the past. That's not the point of studying history. It's not as a guide to sorting the very complex present into easily identifiable boxes, and it's not a guide, it's not a roadmap to the future either. There aren't any lessons in the past, not in that kind of if A then B sense. The kaleidoscope of historical narratives that you can find in the media that are offered to explain Putin's behavior, to me that hints at the inutility of history as a guide to understanding the irreducibly complex future and the immediate past. There's just too much information to sort through. And our selection of those paths is too selective to be really very helpful. I think the use of history as an instrument, though, is likely to continue. I think if there is such a thing as human nature, that's a big part of it. We're all pattern recognition machines. Aristotle points out that all men by nature desire to know. Right? All human beings have this desire to know, to sort out their environment, to make sense of their surroundings, and to figure out where they're going. So I don't think there's going to be a widespread acceptance that an opaque future or a messy present is going to be easy to understand, or that we can accept that. So, therefore, call to action. I used to work in advertising for Yellow Book, and this was always an important part of putting together ads for businesses, right? Come in and get 20% off, right? Call to action. So call to action for historians. More than ever, I think the historian is an important figure in all of this. And not because the historian, not because she's wisest, not because she can master the evidence, interpret the past, and offer up its lessons as a guide, because historians are fallible, they're human beings. But historians, I think, can be a crucial reservoir of uncertainty and doubt, and they can stress contingency and complicate narratives. They can be sort of the catalyst for introducing this uncertainty into otherwise potentially spiraling discourses. They can break that spiral and bring it back down to a level of complexity, which, while frustrating, is infinitely less dangerous to me than simple narratives that lock you into ways of seeing things, which might be wrong, or even if aren't wrong, can lead to aggression and warfare. That's all. So I will take any and all